The genesis of tonight actually started 3 years ago. In the first year curriculum, the students have to take church history. And as we were looking at the syllabus for church history, we realized that all of the texts that were being used were basically Western biblical church history text about white people. And so I went to Bishop Merritt. Did I see you come in? You were here? Yep. And we had lunch together, and I said, I need some help here. There's more church history than just church history for white people. And we want to have a part of that in our curriculum, but I don't know where to look for that. So we had lunch, we had some conversations about that. That began a process that has led in part to tonight. And so we do have that as a part of our curriculum, and we're continuing to grow that, not just in church history, but in other areas of theology as well. And we just thought that it would be important to understand as a part of that the breadth of who we are as a city and the CSRA, all of us, that it would be helpful to understand a little bit more about the African American church in our city. And so that's the genesis of inviting Corey Rogers to come tonight. Corey is an educator. He is also the current historian at the Laney Museum. And there may be a few other things Corey would like to share about himself. But Corey, would you come now and teach us some about the church here in Augusta?
Good evening. How's everyone doing? Doing good? Great. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank First Pres for hosting me and having me here this evening. I never feel like a stranger when I come here to First Pres. There are so many familiar faces. Who can't have a great evening, once you see Julian walk in and everything, and see that smile, and that's it. Mike Heron, as always good to see you. I was teasing, I guess it was Mike. Yeah, I was teasing Mike. I said, people introduce me, especially when I'm at First Pres, people always introduce me and say, oh yeah, that's Carl's brother and everything. And so, I was like, okay. So yeah, my brother Carl Rogers attended First Pres for many years. And even though I'm the oldest, I always take a back seat. Carl, I always take a back seat. Thank you, Mike, once again for inviting me. Actually, there's not much more to say. You said my entire resume. Okay, I work at the museum. That's it. No, actually, I'm a native of Augusta, Georgia, born and raised here. Proud graduate of Davidson Fine Arts Magnet School. Went on to South Carolina State University, Georgia Southern University, so forth and so on. Was one of the interesting things, though, about my upbringing in Augusta was that, personally speaking, I knew very little about the black experience in Augusta, even growing up here. A lot of it was just not taught. My parents are not originally from Augusta. They're from South Carolina. So a lot of that lineage sort of went back to South Carolina and not necessarily Augusta. So I'll tell this quick story since I do have the podium. I guess I can tell the story. I got a phone call in graduate school from Beverly Barnhart. She was the principal of Davidson, but she also was the president of the board of directors, the board of trustees at the Augusta Museum. And she asked me if I wanted to intern at the Augusta Museum. And believe it or not, as an adult, that was sort of my first jump or first leap into the history of Augusta seen through the lens of the Black experience. And from that internship, I began to sort of expand my knowledge, areas that I became very interested in. I started exploring people that I had only known because of a school named for them or a street named for them. Now I could kind of put some meat on the bones, if you will. And these people and these entities began to come alive for me. And so that was 1998. I started working at the Laney Museum in 2004, and it seems like they can't get rid of me. I'm stuck there, you know. But one of the key elements of studying and learning about Augusta's African American experience was obviously the church-going experience. And my family and I spent 30 years at Greater Mount Canaan Baptist Church in Sand Hills, or in the Hill as we call it, growing up. And that was a remarkable experience for me. There's still things to this day that I look back very fondly on, those connections and those ties to not just Greater Mount Canaan, but the community that grew up around the Black church-going experience. And so that in and of itself has been a benefit to me as I've gotten older and older and starting to lose my hair older. Okay. So that being said, I was asked here tonight to talk a little bit about the history of the African American churches in the greater Augusta area or the river region. I'm going to make a few remarks. I'm going to highlight several important key churches and figures that I think have led to the development of the Black church experience in this area. I'll leave time for questions at the end. And let me just sort of say this at the onset. There are so many churches that I could talk about. I decided to kind of pick a few to talk about and highlight tonight. So if I don't do all 185 churches, don't hold that against me. Okay, there always can be a part two to this. There always can be a part two. All right. Okay. So there's a joke among many in the African American community about Black churches in Augusta, at least from my perspective. It is often said that you can find an African American church on almost every corner in Augusta. This is, of course, a small exaggeration, but there is a lot of truth wrapped up in this statement. There are dozens of African American churches of every denomination in the Augusta area. But Augusta's African American church community goes beyond just sheer numbers. Many historians, including myself, argue that Augusta is one of the major focal points for the African American religious world in North America, with a particular emphasis on the Baptist church and one specific strand of Methodism, the CME's or Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Let's start this evening by taking a look at some of Augusta's significant Baptist churches. For many decades, there has been a civil war in the Baptist church in the United States. And this civil war has been fought in the great state of Georgia. The conflict does not involve the sacraments. The conflict is not over finances or cultural issues. No, this civil war is over age. Which African American Baptist church is the oldest Baptist church in North America? For historians in Savannah, they say First African Baptist Church. But us Augustans, we say it's Springfield Baptist Church. This argument has gone back and forth for decades. Dr. Ed Cashin, in his 1995 book, Old Springfield, Race and Religion in Augusta, outlines the argument for Springfield being the oldest. However, when you go to Savannah, their historians, especially the ones giving the tours at First African, will tell you otherwise. I am not sure if this argument will ever be resolved. But what I do know is Augusta, and in a wider sense, the state of Georgia, is ground zero for the development of many of America's iconic and consequential churches, in particular the Baptist and the CME Church. Truth be told, there are 4 churches that have some claim to being the oldest, but for the sake of historical accuracy and time, I'm not going to try and make a determination tonight. Instead, I will just lay out for you a very rich and powerful legacy. This legacy begins during the colonial period. And as you see here, these are the 4 churches in the greater, we'll say Georgia and South Carolina if we include Silver Bluff, but these are some of the origin churches. Silver Bluff, 1750, Springfield, 1787, and then there are 2 churches in Savannah, First Bryan and First African, 1788 and 1788. In 1750, Silver Bluff Baptist Church was established in Beach Island, South Carolina, 16 years before the Declaration of Independence. In 1787, Reverend Jesse Peters Golphin came across from the South Carolina side of the Savannah River to the Georgia side and began converting souls near what is today Reynolds Street. That area saw the development of Springfield Baptist Church. The African American enclave that grew up around the church became known as the Springfield Village. So we've got Silver Bluff, First Bryan, First African, and Springfield. Let's just focus for a moment on Springfield. The Springfield Village covered much of what is today the area near the Marriott Hotel all the way down to 15th Street. Over time, the Springfield Village became a thriving African American community comprised of sections for the enslaved as well as sections designed for free persons of color. During the colonial period, but more prevalent during the antebellum period, the village, with the church as the epicenter of the community, began to develop into an area comprised of teachers, preachers, bricklayers, carpenters, and many other professions. Springfield's status as one of the major religious institutions in the Black Baptist faith was firmly rooted for much of the 19th century. The 2 other churches that are worth mentioning, even though they fall outside of our geographic location, and I mentioned them earlier, are First Bryan and First African Baptist Church in Savannah. All of these churches were established in the same time frame, Silver Bluff a few decades earlier than the others. But as you do a deep dive into the history of these churches, you will recognize some of the same names that connect these churches together. David George, George Lyle, Reverend Andrew Bryan, and Reverend Jesse Peters Golphin. The Black community, like everyone else in the 13 colonies, were split over revolution. The Black church was no exception. Some ministers, like David George, left with the British. You can see their ministry continue in places like Jamaica, Nova Scotia, Sierra Leone in West Africa. And here you see the 1902 brick structure of Springfield Baptist Church, and you'll see over here in the inset the Springfield Village Park. I am sure that many of you have heard that the most segregated time in America is 11 o'clock a.m. on a Sunday morning. That is probably still true in most instances, although many congregations, like First Pres, have had and continue to have a more diverse congregation. The reason why I bring this to your attention at this time is many Americans often don't understand the mechanics of the Black church and the role that it plays in the larger African American community. The Black church has always been and continues to be a place where religion, politics, education, and other cultural aspects of the Black community can be found. Springfield is a great example of that. For the 30 years or so after the Civil War, Springfield continued to be the main African American church in Augusta and in the state of Georgia in many respects. In 1866, however, a group of Black leaders began holding their meetings at Springfield. This was the formation of the Georgia Equal Rights Association, which today we call simply the Georgia Republican Party. A year later, in 1867, Reverend William Jefferson White, the associate pastor of Springfield Baptist Church, co-founded a school for young men who wanted to go into the seminary. They called this school the Augusta Baptist Institute. In 1868, Reverend White would leave Springfield to start his own church, Harmony Baptist Church, near Campbell Street or James Brown Boulevard today. The school would move with him and eventually move to Friendship Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia in 1879. In 1913, what started out as the Augusta Baptist Institute at Springfield Baptist Church changed its name to Morehouse College, and since its beginning has educated some of the best and brightest in the country, from Professor A.R. Johnson, Reverend C.T. Walker, to decades later, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the Honorable Maynard Jackson, actors Samuel L. Jackson, filmmaker Spike Lee, Reverend Otis Moss Jr., and former Tabernacle Baptist Church pastor Reverend Otis Moss III. Even though Springfield continued to be a major driving force in the black community, other churches began to pop up in the Augusta area and challenge it for religious supremacy. So here we have a 1952 inside view of Springfield Baptist Church. Over here, this is a pretty interesting shot. You can see both the St. John's building here and the 1902 building. Here's the marker indicating Morehouse College was founded here in Augusta at Springfield in 1867. The St. John's building was purchased from St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1840. The building itself was built in 1800. It was moved to the current site on Reynolds Street, and it remained the main worship center for Springfield until around 1902, 1903. It took about 5 years, from 1897 to 1902, to build the brick structure that you see here. That's the current building for Springfield Baptist Church. And if you ever get a chance to visit Springfield, you'll see this mural. It's a wonderful mural with Reverend White in the middle, surrounded by various graduates of the Augusta Institute or Morehouse College. The gentleman you see here is Professor or President Richard R. Wright. And over here you see Ware High School, named for Edmund Asa Ware, president of Atlanta University. Now, here's an interesting connection. Richard Wright was a classmate of a young lady by the name of Lucy Craft Laney. They were classmates at Atlanta University. He would move to Augusta and in 1880 would become the headmaster of Ware High School, all located in the Springfield Village community. Ware is the oldest African-American public high school in the state of Georgia. Professor Wright would leave Ware and eventually would become the first African-American president of what is today Savannah State University. Another aspect of the African-American church-going experience that is unique to the black experience is Emancipation Day services. After the Civil War, these services were held to commemorate January 1st, 1863, and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which laid the foundation for the 13th Amendment in 1865. Today, the only church in the Augusta area that still holds an Emancipation Day service that I know of, at least on a large scale, is Tabernacle Baptist Church. But in the days after the Civil War, that was a very prominent celebration at a variety of churches, especially at Springfield. This is the aforementioned Harmony Baptist Church, located near Laney Walker Boulevard, or at the time Gwinnett Street. It wasn't Laney Walker just yet. This is the Reverend William Jefferson White, and this is Professor Augustus R. Johnson, or A.R. Johnson. He was the superintendent of Sunday schools at Harmony Baptist, and Reverend White was the founder of the church. If you would like more information about Reverend William J. White, the person who is the preeminent scholar on the life of Reverend White is an Augusta native. His name is Dr. Bobby Donaldson. Some of you may even know Bobby. Bobby is a graduate of Davidson, professor of history at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, and he is the foremost authority on Reverend William J. White. In 1840, enslaved Augustans living on the east boundary of the city broke away from Springfield and started their own church. This would keep them from having to travel to the west side of Augusta every Sunday. Thus was formed the Independent Baptist Church, the first daughter church of Springfield Baptist Church. To give thanks for their bountiful blessings, Independent Baptist Church in 1844 became Thankful Baptist Church. Around the same time that Thankful was positioning itself as the dominant religious institution on the east side of town, Central African Baptist Church in 1856 was established on 12th Street near what is today Laney Walker Boulevard. This gave the Baptist denomination a major presence in most of the city of Augusta, with Springfield in the west, Thankful in the east, and Central African in the center. So during the turn of the century, Thankful would become a major focal point in the black community. It had a sanctuary that could seat roughly 900, making it one of the largest at that time, around 1900. And because of that, these two individuals, when they came to Augusta in 1898 and 1899, spoke at Thankful. So in 1899, the Augusta chapter of Atlanta University welcomed Dr. Du Bois. And a year later, Reverend C.T. Walker welcomed his friend, Booker T. Washington, and they both lectured at Thankful Baptist Church on the east boundary of Augusta. In 1879, about 70 members of Springfield Baptist Church requested and received letters of separation to form their own church. The building they chose had previously been occupied by other African American denominations, primarily Methodists. It had also been used by First Presbyterian Church for a variety of reasons during and after the Civil War. These former members of Springfield formed Union Baptist Church. Because most of the founding members were the sons and daughters of wealthy planters, many of them were very fair complexion and often took on an elitist air about them. Some of the members of Union included Dr. John Hope, the first black president of Morehouse and Atlanta University, Mr. Frank Yerby, one of the most influential and successful 20th century authors. Here's Frank Yerby. And here's a picture of Union, probably taken around 2008, after it had been fully restored. Many of you may remember driving down Green Street and seeing this church falling into disrepair. Historic Augusta, with the assistance of several in the city, put in about $500,000 of restoration into Union. And so today it's one of the crowning achievements of preservation in the Augusta area. Mother Trinity, so I'm kind of switching denominations. Mother Trinity was established in 1840 when African American members of the Integrated St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church South split away and found a site on 8th Street to begin anew. Trinity remained an independent church for nearly 30 years. In 1870, it became a founding member of the newly created Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, which was formed in Tennessee. Trinity would become a dominant force among African American churches in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of its members included Bishop Lucius Henry Holsey, called the father of black education of the CME Church. His vision laid the foundation for the creation of what is today Payne College, founded as Payne Institute in 1882. John Wesley Gilbert, the first black faculty member of Payne College and one of the leading archaeologists and anthropologists and authorities on classical languages in the early 20th century. I must apologize. In my haste to get here, I forgot one slide, but I'll just sort of verbalize it for you. Just recently, one of the colleges in Athens, many of you may have seen this, named either a room or part of the college after John Wesley Gilbert in Athens, Greece. And a lot of his work, although he was from Augusta, was done in Italy and in Greece. And so there's a really interesting connection there of his legacy sort of crossing the Atlantic. Ursula Collins, noted educator and administrator, was a member of Mother Trinity. Collins Elementary School in Augusta was named in her honor. Amanda America Dixon Toomer, considered one of the richest African Americans in the country in the late 19th century, was a member of Mother Trinity. She, in fact, inherited her wealth. And on my way over here, I had to detour and go down to the Amanda House. That's the Hawk Law Group office at 448 Telfair Street. It's owned by the Hawk Development Company. And I got a text message from John Hawk last night. The marker is going up. The marker is going up. So Amanda's historic marker was just placed in the ground about 4 hours ago. And we'll have the unveiling May 21st at 11 o'clock. So I'm really excited about honoring Amanda, who was, in fact, one of the wealthiest African Americans in the country, twice as wealthy as Frederick Douglass in 1886, to just put that in perspective. About $400,000, if you will. Reverend Channing Tobias, CME minister, YMCA executive, and president of the Board of Trustees for the NAACP during Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, also a member of Mother Trinity. He was also instrumental in changing the name of the denomination from colored to Christian Methodist Episcopal in 1954. Carrie Mays, business owner and the first female city councilwoman in Augusta's history, member of Mother Trinity. Here's a great shot of some of the members of Mother Trinity. Carrie Mays is right here. This is the mother of the Honorable William H. Mays III, Willie Mays. Okay. A few other images. This was during the marker unveiling for Mother Trinity in October of 2016. The members of Mother Trinity you see here, excluding the bishop and Reverend Skip Mason, everyone else, they are descendants of that original group from 1840 that marched from St. John's over to the new site. So there are two families in the church that are still have a direct line from the original members. One of the first graduating classes from Payne Institute. Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Bethel was established in 1852 as Bethel Church and became a member of the AME Church in 1865 during the conference in Charleston, South Carolina. The first pastor was Reverend Samuel Drayton, but it was Reverend Lynch who was instrumental in bringing Bethel into the AME Church. The church was originally located on the corner of Campbell and Yaknak Streets, but in the early 2000s, it moved to the Harrisburg community. And if I reference Campbell, I'm just simply mentioning James Brown Boulevard or 9th Street. Among its members are former United States Ambassador to Botswana, Horace Dawson, under the Carter administration, and stage and film actor Jerome Preston Bates. This is St. Mary's Episcopal Church on 12th Street, established February 12th, 1889. They've also had several prominent members come through St. Mary's. Many of you may know Russell Joel Brown. You know Russell? Okay, the Brown family. Yeah, so Russell and the Browns are all members of St. Mary's. Also, to kind of show you a little cultural connection, how many of you have ever walked into Washington Hall on the campus of Augusta University? Okay, so Justine and Ike Washington, the namesake for Washington Hall at Augusta University, they were members of St. Mary's Episcopal Church. Christ Presbyterian Church, established October 15th, 1882. Originally located on Telfair Street, it moved to Gwinnett Street in the early 20th century. I brought with me an image of the current Christ Presbyterian Church and some of the members over the years, the Ellis sisters. And if you look at the history of Christ Presbyterian Church, it was their father, Reverend James Ellis, that orchestrated the move from Telfair Street to its current location on Laney Walker Boulevard. This is Rosa C. Tutt and her husband, John M. Tutt. So that's John M. Tutt Middle School in West Augusta. So they lived on Phillip Street next to this woman here. This is Lucy Craft Laney. So they were all members of Christ Presbyterian Church. And when Haynes was founded, when the Haynes Institute was founded, established and chartered in 1886, many of the ministers from Christ Presbyterian Church would teach religion at the Haynes Institute, which was located right across the street. And I'll talk a little bit more about Miss Laney and her impact along the way. I sort of intentionally didn't not kind of put her to the side, but she's sort of my stock in trade. I taught Lucy Laney all day, every day for the past 17 years. So I didn't want to keep y'all here until 10 p.m. tonight. So here's an image of the Haynes Institute. And Haynes was a private boarding school. It reached its peak around the turn of the century. Right around that time was when Lucy Laney started becoming a household name. You know, here's a woman in Augusta. She never married, never had any children, so to speak, but she was a mother to the community in Augusta. Lucy Laney personally trained Mary McLeod Bethune, who came to Augusta and worked with Lucy Craft Laney. And so Haynes was not just your average everyday school. It was a private boarding school that was also a blueprint for other schools that began to develop during this time as segregation began to fully take root at this time. Over here is an image of Margaret Louise Laney. She was also a member of Christ Presbyterian Church, the only relative that lived in Augusta with Lucy Laney, her aunt. And the image I brought with me, kind of interesting, you'll see Dr. Benjamin E. Mays in the background. This is actually the pulpit of Tabernacle Baptist Church here in Augusta. This is May 31st, 1976, around 5 o'clock p.m. Why is that so significant? That's the rededication of Gwinnett Street. That's the day it became Laney Walker Boulevard. I wanted to kind of break up sort of the talk of church after church to talk just briefly about how we sort of know a lot about these churches and sort of their comings and goings and their dealings and some of the people associated with them. So I wanted to kind of call to your attention an article from the 1920s in the Augusta Chronicle. The headline read, "Augusta, a good place for colored people." And what you see here is I kind of chopped up this article written by this young man here. This is the Reverend Silas Xavier Floyd. Reverend Silas X. Floyd, pastor of Tabernacle Baptist Church, editor, poet, author, historian, best friend to this man here, the Reverend C.T. Walker. They were very good friends. And the three of them, Booker T. Washington, he would often come to Augusta to visit Floyd and Walker. But it's sort of interesting that a lot of what we know about the African American churches, the people that lived in these communities, actually came from these columns that Reverend Floyd wrote, mainly between 1915 and the early 1960s. They were called Notes Among the Colored, or News Among the Colored. Augusta Chronicle became a segregated newspaper in 1915. And so twice a week, you could find a column designated just for black news in Augusta. And Silas Floyd, who, by the way, the school no longer exists, but behind Mays Mortuary on 9th Street, there's a school there that used to be Silas Floyd School. That is the school that James Brown attended while he was here in Augusta, named in his honor. So Reverend Floyd wrote these columns, and they were very detailed. They were very intricate. I mean, he detailed every single thing happening in the black community. When the great opera diva Marian Anderson came to Haynes to sing in the 1920s, all of it is documented because Floyd was there. And because he was there, he was able to lay out the significance and importance of the Black Baptist Church as well, or the black church as well. Tabernacle Baptist Church and the rise of Reverend C.T. Walker. Tabernacle came out of a tumultuous split at Central African Baptist Church. The split was much publicized in the Augusta Chronicle and involved different factions in the church. Part of the church was firmly behind this young, charismatic minister born enslaved in Hepzibah, Georgia, on the Walker Plantation. Reverend C.T. Walker, like Miss Laney, was born during the twilight of slavery. Spiritually, he was raised at Franklin Covenant Baptist Church in Hepzibah and was ordained there at a very early age. Reverend Walker received his formal education from the Augusta Baptist Institute, but he was also known for apprenticing himself to different professionals to become more knowledgeable of the world around him. We've got Reverend Walker right here. Before becoming pastor of Central African Baptist Church in the 1880s, he pastored numerous churches in the greater Augusta area. He even spent several years at First Baptist Church of LaGrange, Georgia, before coming back to Central African Baptist Church. In August of 1885, he took his half of Central African Baptist Church, the congregation, and during a meeting in the Fellowship Hall of Union Baptist Church, the aforementioned Union, he established a new church called Biela Baptist Church, later changed to Tabernacle Baptist Church, today the largest African American church in the Augusta area. This is the original look of Tabernacle, 1 steeple versus 2. Also the location, this is the Gwinnett Street or Laney Walker location. This is the Marbury Street near Springfield, near Reynolds. So originally it was further down closer to the river. And it would move to this location around 1918, 1917. As word continued to spread about this young charismatic minister, his congregation continued to grow and grow. Within a decade, Tabernacle's congregation was close to 2,000. C.T. Walker gained international acclaim when he took a trip in 1891 to the Middle East. He even picked up a nickname along the way, the Black Spurgeon, named for the 19th century minister Charles Spurgeon. In 1899, he would leave Augusta for Harlem, New York, to become pastor of Mount Olivet Baptist Church. During his time at Mount Olivet between 1899 and 1903, he would meet and become acquainted with John D. Rockefeller. He stays at Mount Olivet for roughly 4 years before returning to Augusta, assuming his duties at Tabernacle. While he was gone, his best friend, Reverend Silas Floyd, stepped in and became pastor of Tabernacle until Reverend Walker returned. Reverend Walker would remain pastor of Tabernacle until his death in 1921. His home still stands at 1101 Laney Walker Boulevard and is almost fully restored by historic Augusta. So Tabernacle, because of this strong personality, would become this magnet. And people from all over the country visiting Augusta would come to Tabernacle. And it would become the epicenter of the Gwinnett Street corridor. So we have President William Howard Taft, who visited Tabernacle at least 3 times. We've got John D. Rockefeller, who visited Tabernacle at least 3 times. And we have George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, who both visited Reverend Walker and his church. And as a small historical aside, just as the Presbyterians established the Haynes Institute, the Baptists also had their own school equivalent to Haynes, and it was the Walker Baptist Institute. So in that period, between 1897 and 1937, when there were no public high schools for African Americans in Augusta, a 40-year span, there were private schools that each Christian denomination set up during that time frame. So the Baptists, Reverend Walker and his family, had the Walker Baptist Institute. The Methodists had Payne Institute. The Presbyterians had the Haynes Institute. And in 1913, the Catholic Church would make inroads and start Immaculate Conception Academy. So one of the questions that's often asked of me, why was the minister a logical choice to lead a civil rights movement? And I'm going to when I started this talk, I told you that I was going to bring in sort of various elements of the Black Baptist Church or the Black Church, from politics, religion, education. And it goes without saying that the minister would become one of the focal points and one of the leaders of the modern civil rights movement. So Augusta's ministers, attorneys, all became some of the leaders in Augusta's civil rights movement. This is Reverend Charles Spencer Hamilton, came to Augusta in 1955 as pastor of Tabernacle, and Reverend Nathaniel Thomas Young, who came to Augusta in 1945 as pastor of Thankful Baptist Church. They formed a partnership. I sometimes like to say kind of a Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King type partnership, if you will. And they would lead Augusta as the head of the Augusta NAACP. They would lead Augusta through the modern civil rights movement. Here you see, as I showed in the previous slide here, this is August of 1963. For my history buffs out there, August of 63, group of people boarding a train. I think you may know where they're going. They're going to D.C. So then attorney John H. Ruffin, Reverend Hamilton, and 28 others were going to the March on Washington, 1963. Gentleman here, who was a member of Springfield Baptist Church, and I just wanted to kind of include and lump him in with Attorney Ruffin. This is Attorney James Nabrit. His father was the pastor of Springfield Baptist Church. He was Thurgood Marshall's second chair on Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Augusta native. So, Dr. King, I'm often asked about his connection to Augusta, and since I'm talking about church history, why not connect him in the 1960s? So Dr. King came to Augusta twice in the 1960s. First, Tabernacle, April 1962. That was his first visit as an adult. When he was a small child, Martin would come with his father, Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., to Augusta, Georgia in the 1930s and 40s. They would visit for some of the Baptist conventions that were held at Tabernacle. But as an adult, his first trip was Tabernacle, and then March 23rd, 1968, his last time in Augusta, and sadly to say, a week later, it would be his last time. He would be in Memphis, Tennessee. He was with the sanitation workers who had gone on strike, but he was getting ready for the second March on Washington. And that's why he was here in Augusta at Biela Grove Baptist Church. This is the original Biela Grove. Well, actually, I take that back. This is the second building. The first was a wood frame structure on 15th Street, and then eventually they moved to Poplar Street. And then many years ago, they built the current sanctuary that you see. And here are some of the ministers associated with King's last visit: Reverend B.I. Vernon from Biela Grove, and Reverend Nathaniel Irvin from Old Storm Branch Baptist Church over in North Augusta. Here are a few of the rural churches in our area: Spirit Creek Baptist Church, 1800, Franklin Covenant, C.T. Walker's Home Church, 1848. The churches of Sand Hill Community, you've got Cumming Grove, 1840, Rock of Ages, here, 1878, Elam, 1886, and Greater Mount Canaan, 1900. The aforementioned Immaculate Conception Academy, the church and the school, Father Laube with one of the first graduating classes here around 1914, 1915. The building, the construction began in 1913. They completed it in 1914. And sadly to say, as many of you know, in its 99th year, it was torn down. Unfortunately, we were not able to save this one. And to kind of close things out, I brought a few random images of Augusta's church-going experience. Reverend S.E. McIntyre, founder, Good Shepherd Baptist Church. This is Miss Golden's Gospel Choir from Mount Calvary Baptist Church. Top row, all the way over, Miss Jessie Norman, right here. This picture was taken around 1959. This is Reverend Thomas Jefferson Hornsby. Reverend Hornsby was the pastor of Antioch Baptist Church, the moderator of the Walker Baptist Association, and the patriarch of the Pilgrim Health and Life Insurance Company. So for those of you who remember, Pilgrim Insurance, one of the largest black-owned insurance companies, it was Reverend Hornsby, a formerly enslaved minister, and his 17-year-old cousin, Mr. Solomon Walker, and 3 others that co-founded what will become one of the largest black-owned insurance companies in the nation. And I started my talk by saying that there was the joke about a black church on every corner, and I said it's a joke, but there is truth to it. And I brought a few others to kind of show you. So Central African, originally on 12th Street, there's now an open lot there, now in South Augusta, founded in 1856, Corinth Baptist Church in South Augusta, 1868. Macedonia Baptist Church, now on Wrightsboro Road, 1870. Mount Calvary in the Bethlehem community, 1881. Broadway Baptist Church out in South Augusta, 1882. Gardner Grove, this is a church that's kind of tucked over on Wheeler Road as you're going over to the movie theater. That's 1894. Miles Memorial CME Church on Martin Luther King Boulevard, 1894. Beulah Grove, 1914. Good Shepherd, 1940. And then Belle, Terrace Presbyterian Church, in a way, kind of came out of Christ Presbyterian in the 1960s and early 70s. And interesting enough, this is actually the neighborhood that my brother and I grew up in. So most of our neighbors were members of Belle Terrace, but we were all members of Greater Mount Canaan at the time. So to all, that concludes my presentation, and I'm here for questions if you have any.
Corey might have something you'd like to present to you.
Okay, thank you guys. Thank you.
Well, Corey, I want to thank you for being here. You've been a friend of mine for many years, and you've been a friend of this church. Now you're a friend of City View Seminary, and we hope to be a good friend and neighbor to not only Lucy Craft Laney Museum, but also to you. I'd like to present you with our church history, 200 years, Cloud of Witnesses book, the story of First Presbyterian Church, 1804 to 2004, and it stops, the church has continued, thank the Lord, since 2004, but I think you'll be excited to know that Lucy Craft Laney makes it into the book before I do. Page 107 and page 126 is Lucy Craft Laney's story and First Pres's involvement with the establishment of Green Street Presbyterian and members leaving here and going there, as well as their involvement with the Haynes Institute when during the burning of the school and using the property. I don't enter till page 207, and then 286 if you want to check that out. The book ends on page 325, so I'm at the end there. Yes, but I do want to read, I would like to read you the note that I wrote you May 4th, 2021. Corey, thank you for your commitment to the past, present, and future of Augusta, Georgia. It's an honor to be your friend. Sincerely in Christ, Dr. Mike Aaron.